Fair warning to all, I'll be reminiscing quite a bit. Hi, I'm Irene, and this is Inkworks. A big welcome to both new and returning viewers. Before getting into the meat of things, I want to give a rundown of the supplies that were used. A 1-inch silver white stroke, a number 4 round Winsor & Newton goat hair brush, a polychromos colored pencil in the color ochre, Kuretake's Art Nouveau watercolor set, and Hanamula's collection cold-pressed watercolor paper. Not shown at this time, but rather later on, number 2 round Princeton Aqua Elite and 2 Faber-Castell Pitt pens in sepia. There are a couple of other items at the end, but I'll leave that as a surprise. Why this art project? Because of sentimentality. I'll explain why this particular image is important to me a little later. At the risk of being called a tease, for now I'll just let you know some topics that'll come up during this video. My childhood, my family, growing up with records, 7th grade music class, and how my musical tastes were formed. I'll also talk about this Roxy Music band. So, growing up, I was always getting into my oldest brother's record collection. Technically, there were some albums that were contributed by others, but for the most part, I always thought of it as Al's records. And that makes sense because he was the one who kept adding to it, continually enlarging the audio library, all the way up to when CDs took over in, I'm gonna say, around 1990. So as a child, I spent a lot of time in Al's room because that's where the records were, along with the hi-fi stereo system. During my early years, I got really familiar with the Beatles, David Bowie, Roxy Music, Queen, Mike Oldfield, Kate Bush, Steel Eye Span, Sparks, Kraftwerk, Elvis Costello, Talking Heads, and a bunch of others. During my teen years, every 2 weeks, I'd find a couple of brand spanking new LPs slipped in alphabetically. Some were from favorite artists, but there were also new discoveries. B-52s, Joe Jackson, Thomas Dolby, New Order, The Smiths, Prefab Sprout, and so on. And that's not even touching on the classical music albums from Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach, including the lesser-known PDQ Bach, for snits and giggles. You'll notice that I only grabbed a handful of colors: flax beige, ecru beige, beige gray, yellow brown, Mars yellow, and Venetian red. I was going for a warm brown and gold cast, so I strictly limited the palette. That pan of ecru beige is giving off strong vanilla ice cream vibes, no? So, to say that my oldest brother had an influence on my music tastes is pretty accurate, if not an outright understatement. Eventually, the day of the CD arrived, and Al never really got on board with that format. So, as a young adult, I started building my own CD collection, and he borrowed some on occasion. Oh, how the tables had turned, and I was justifiably tickled about it. Well, fast forward 30 years. Things happened and possessions got downsized. Now, most of that stuff, LPs, CDs, DVDs, is gone, either sold or donated. Al has since passed away, and one of the few mementos I have from him is a single record album, Flesh and Blood by Roxy Music, that he had framed and hung on his wall. It's been hanging on my studio wall for several years now, and for quite a while I've been wanting to paint it. At the time it was released in 1980, I was around 12, and I played the heck out of that record all through my teen years. Yeah, I'm a long-time Roxy Music fan. In fact, I believe the first LP I ever purchased was Avalon in 1982. That was the band's last studio album and the culmination of their journey from glam art rock to mainstream sophistopop. And Flesh and Blood is closer to Avalon than to anything on their first two albums. Some would say their best stuff was from the 70s, and I won't argue over that because I mostly agree. But come on, same old scene? I can play that track on loop for an hour, and I have many times. By the way, that song was used for the opening sequence of Times Square, a movie from 1980. I haven't seen it, but I understand it has a following. Back to the album itself. Sure, there's no 7-minute long mother of pearl epic track on Flesh and Blood, but there is a funky 8 Miles High cover and a wallowy ballad called My Only Love. Actually, I recall one track got a lot of airplay on my favorite radio station at the time, and that was a cover of Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour. So this Winsor & Newton brush was gifted to me by Anne from the YouTube channel Art on the Creek. I love her channel. I'm always learning new things there, whether it's about products I haven't experienced or art techniques I haven't tried. She's great at bringing you right in and making you feel like, oh yeah, I'm in the right place. In fact, I'd expressed my interest in that particular brush, and she very kindly sent it along so I could experience it for myself. I'll add a link to the video where she used it down in the description. It's different from any of my other brushes due to its lovely bamboo handle, yes, but also due to the use of goat hair. Goat hair is coarser than, say, squirrel or sable, but it's also softer than I expected. Plus, when you get those hairs fully wet, they come to a really nice point. It was fun using it on this piece, but I want to eventually try it for painting with fountain pen inks. A project for another day. Back in the day, having quality audio components was a point of pride, and Al had a pretty decent stereo system. The brands are a bit hazy for me, but the speakers were impressively big. The receiver had plenty of dials and doohickeys. The turntable was in a stained wood housing, but was eventually upgraded to something sleek and shiny. There was also a fancy cassette deck. Many were the mixtapes I made for myself and my best friend. The Memorex clear ones with colorful geometric graphics were my favorites. Being that Al's room was the only one with a hi-fi, I sometimes had to sneak in after he fell asleep. Then I'd fumble in the dark until the glow of electronics kicked in. I remember the chair's abrasive upholstery and slightly pinched ears after wearing headphones for 2 hours. But if I ever accidentally woke him up, he never let on. Oh, did I mention my brother was also an artist? Well, he was really good with drawing, at least. He actually recreated a couple of Roxy Music covers with pencils. So it didn't surprise me that this album was one of his favorites. Look, this isn't the first time I've talked about my brother Al. There's a whole video from a couple of years ago where I specifically talked about our shared interest in movies. I'll add a link to that one in the description. 15 years may have separated us, but by golly, we had a lot in common. After high school, when I was working on the Army base, one of the first things I spent my hard-earned money on was a Walkman. And when I say Walkman, I mean a cheap knockoff, because I'm pretty sure I couldn't afford an actual Sony Walkman. This was back when Sony had a reputation for high-quality products. In later years, I heard grumblings about how Sony was going downhill, but I don't go around buying electronics willy-nilly, so you tell me, is that true or not? Anyway, that Walkman kept me sane while spending 3 hours a day riding public transit. Maybe they should have called it the Ride Man. The sound quality of cassettes was already compromised, but pair that with a cheap player and headphones, and I'm surprised I didn't end up bleeding out of my ears. I'm kidding. That was never a thing. When I was a preteen, my older sister was really into the TV show American Bandstand with Dick Clark. They showed young people dancing to the current hits. Then a couple of them would review a new track and have to justify their ratings. That led to the cliched frequent answer of, "It's got a good beat and you can dance to it." My sister was also into the American Top 40 Countdown with Casey Kasem. It was a radio program that listed, in reverse order, the 40 most popular songs of the week. So, once a week, my sister and I would plop down on Mom's bed, turn on the clock radio, and tune into KTAC 85 AM, just so she could write down the titles and artists in her notebook. Yeah, that's what we resorted to for entertainment in the dark days before the internet. One of these days, I should call her up and, in a panicked voice, say, "What was the #1 song on June 12th, 1979? I need to know now." At some point, my sisters got a second-hand record player for their room and built a modest LP collection of their own. It just couldn't compare to Al's, though, and I'm not even talking about size. They had stuff like Physical by Olivia Newton-John. Look, I think Olivia was a fantastic music artist. I even watched both Grease and Xanadu when they were playing in cinemas. But Physical just wasn't my jam. Since we're talking about music, I'll share my memories of 7th grade music class. I must have been around 13, I think. They made us learn how to play the recorder. The recorder is a type of flute and is part of the wind family of instruments. Whoa, it's all coming back to me. Listening to my instructor play My Sharona on her bass guitar, getting sorted as a mezzo. Everyone knows it's the sopranos who get the glory. Struggling to toot out "Mary Had a Little Lamb," and stifling my rage as the mean girls behind me kept kicking my chair. But I did like my music instructor. She was young and hip in a nerdy way. I mean, she wore glasses and elbow patches for crying out loud, but she occasionally brought in a record to play for us. My favorite of those was Manhattan Transfer's Extensions. Maybe because I was already familiar with it, since it was in our own record collection. Extensions was the album that had their hit single, Birdland. But my favorite track was Trickle Trickle, a cover of the 1958 song by The Videos. Most of our school's student body was made up of KZOK rockers. You know, the kids who only listened to AC/DC and Led Zeppelin. Needless to say, I felt pretty smug that day. So, my earliest music memory, I think I was 6 years old when I danced to Midnight at the Oasis by Maria Muldaur. It's a catchy song, and in 1974, it was a popular hit single. I loved the album cover, so colorful and dreamy, with Maria floating amongst clouds on a magic carpet. Of course, now I know what she was singing about. That's right. Old me wants to travel back in time to young me and shoo her away from "you won't need no harem, honey," to protect that innocent naivete. While I never saw Roxy Music perform live, I did catch Brian Ferry on his As Time Goes By tour in 1999. It was at the Paramount Theater in Seattle. The show was fabulous. A nice mix of Ferry's solo songs and material from his Roxy Music years. The stage was full of musicians, a string section including a harp, horns and brass, and even a grand piano. I may have a number of live musicals under my belt, but there are only two concert performances: Brian Ferry and Andrea Bocelli. I cherish both those experiences. The final details were done with gouache. Using a number 2 Princeton Umbria Bright, I whitened the togas. And using a number 2 Princeton Select Round, I brightened the highlights on the hair. I know all of Roxy Music's albums from back to front, and in my opinion, their peak was in 1974. That was the year my all-time favorite Roxy Music song, Out of the Blue, came out. Also, 1976, because that was the year of the Viva album and the 11-minute-long live performance of If There Is Something. I love that version because, in my opinion, it improved the song, creating a truly moody work of art. But it was the studio recording of If There Is Something in all of its original rough glory that inspired the movie Flashbacks of a Fool. That was back in 2008 and starred Daniel Craig and Felicity Jones. The song pops up very effectively a couple of times during the film. I may have even shed a tear or 12 at the end. I guess if there's a point to all of this, it's that inspiration is a never-ending cycle. One piece of art can lead to many others, just like in that old TV commercial for Fabergé shampoo. I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and so on, and so on. My thoughts on this painting? Honestly, I'm not happy with the results. It doesn't do justice to the source. Maybe it was the choices that were made, or maybe I was tired, or perhaps distracted by the memories. The supplies aren't to blame. But I'm also not going to beat myself up over it. That's not what we do here. Because no matter how poorly a piece ends up, I can always say, at least it's not as bad as Eagle versus Rabbit. That was my worst painting ever. Or at least the worst that's been shared on this channel. No, there isn't going to be a link. If you're consumed with curiosity, go digging in the video archive yourself. I'm happy to share this arting session. Crossing a project off the list feels good, right? Like when you finish writing a letter to an art friend, then seal it, slap a stamp on it, and maybe doodle some flowers on the envelope. Because that means it's reward time. 2 scoops of butter pecan ice cream. Then, just as you're about to dig in, you realize you forgot to include the drawing you made for them, and that you'll have to tear open the envelope and use a new one. 3 scoops of butter pecan ice cream. Until next time, remember. No, that's it. Just remember. And stay artsy, my friends. Since there's time, I'll continue the Roxy Music Love Fest by throwing in some factoid tidbits. David Bowie, a fellow glam contemporary and admirer of the band, sometimes covered Roxy Music's songs during his live performances. He also recorded a studio cover of If There Is Something with his band Tin Machine. Roxy Music's most covered song, however, is probably More Than This, having been recorded by 10,000 Maniacs, Robin Hitchcock, Blondie, Norah Jones, and others. Special mention goes to Bill Murray in Lost in Translation. Always big in Britain, while mostly ignored in the US, Roxy Music was, at long last, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2019.